Alright, folks. Post-fight review to the fight contested between Mark Magsayo and Brandon Figueroa. Contested for the WBC interim featherweight title. The main event to a triple header, which also involved Jarrett Hurd's unsuccessful return to the ring, and a fight between two middleweight prospects. Both of the previous fights were middleweight contests, by the way. Elijah Garcia and Amilcar Vidal. The main event had high stakes at featherweight, as the winner here would get an opportunity to contest against Rey Vargas, who himself unsuccessfully challenged for world titles in a higher weight category, but nevertheless retained his belt. I think his motivations for going up in weight, considering they were derailed, I think he held on to this belt just in case, so that he could still have some leverage and get back to having big fights anyways in a separate weight category. But this fight between Figueroa versus Magsayo was definitely interesting. Both guys were coming off of defeats, at least somewhat recently. Figueroa, a very close, razor-thin decision loss to Stephen Fulton, the current unified 122-pound champion. And Mark Magsayo coming off of a defeat to Rey Vargas in his previous fight. In fact, Figueroa's last fight was actually on a Magsayo undercard, where he made his 126-pound debut, at least in this stint, against Carlos Castro, who himself is a very tall, lanky fighter moving up in weight. Interesting fight anyways. This was the main event, but I think maybe slightly underwhelming, marred with a fair bit of fouling, I think initiated by both men. The referee came down quite harshly on Magsayo, was definitely punishing his infringements, I think, far more than Magsayo, but Magsayo was definitely, in my view, initiating much of the clinching. He was leading with his head. He was using his forearms, elbowing, and definitely being very physical himself, straying low with many of his shots. I actually think, in terms of the bulk, or at least the person who committed more infringements, was probably Magsayo in totality, but in terms of separate, isolated infringements, Figueroa was probably doing the bulk of them. But Magsayo's clinching, I presume the referee was more willing to and more eager to come down on his, considering the fact that his clinching was definitely starting to inhibit the pace and the flow of the fight. I predicted that Figueroa would actually score a late stoppage in this fight. I did not pick Magsayo to last the distance. I felt Magsayo was capable of scoring a knockout if he landed the right shot here or there, which didn't really necessarily come because Figueroa has a tremendous chin. But really, I figured Magsayo would lose this fight for the same reason he lost the Vargas fight, not necessarily stylistically, but in the fact that, despite the fact that he's athletically extremely gifted, both hand and foot speed, he has good technique, and he does hit very hard. He has no idea how to control the pace of a fight or pace himself. So even though he comes into fights in very good condition, he really has no idea how to prevent himself from fatiguing. And he also doesn't have any form of a jab, meaning he's not going to be able to control distance. Figueroa is going to find it very easy, and as he did, to collapse the pocket. Magsayo, I thought, posed a little bit more resistance, and I think one of the main reasons he was able to go the full distance was he actually posed a little bit more resistance on the inside than I figured he would. I figured he would be a little bit more susceptible to body shots, and he wouldn't be as willing to smother in this fight as he was, which were partially the reasons why Julio Ceja was able to bully him around on the inside, even though he himself is a smaller guy than Figueroa. So he has improved on the inside, but he lacks any form of a jab, and even though he has he showed a little bit of resistance on the inside, it's just not good enough to be able to outgun Figueroa within that construct, and at mid-range was where the bulk of his success was going to be in this fight, and he needed a jab to be able to traverse in between long and mid-range and land those shots in between Figueroa's attacks, and he really just lacked it. In fact, I counted more times during the fight where he would actually lead with a lead straight right hand followed by a 1, as opposed to vice versa, a 1-2. He has pretty much no interest in, controlling distance. He just wants to basically outslug his opponents, and, fair enough. But it wasn't going to work here. Figueroa, defensively, has not gotten any better. But offensively, he does prove to be a force. He has tremendous variation. He can switch hit. He is a very, very effective body puncher and was able to pretty much fatigue Magsayo and force him to crumble down the stretch. It took a hell of a lot of heart for Magsayo to be able to continue on. He was deducted multiple points, and Figueroa ultimately capitalized. By just overall being, I think, the slightly better schooled fighter, Magsayo too tires himself out with his footwork, with the fact that he's constantly bouncing. He doesn't know how to pivot, and he doesn't know how to punch on the move either. He constantly has to set, reset, and that can be very exhausting on the thighs and the calves. His legs were tired in the final 3-4 rounds. You could visibly notice him hanging on for dear life. He was having to hold on to, Figueroa's waist to actually prevent himself from sinking to the canvas, which he did in the 12th round, which really could have been potentially ruled as a knockdown, but he was docked a point in round 11 for holding, which pretty much ended any hopes he had of winning. Really, he didn't have much hopes of winning anyways because the scorecards came out pretty wide. I thought Magsayo did get off to quite a bit of a lead early on. I thought Figueroa may have potentially underestimated the physical strength and how Magsayo's athleticism was going to potentially carry over into this fight. And he was trying to box him and work his way around Magsayo from the outside, and he was just finding it difficult to land on the target considering the difference in speed and athleticism between the two. But it just wasn't a sustainable fight, and Figueroa was able to work his way in, and even if his rounds were less emphatic than some of Magsayo's early rounds in terms of the fancy eye-catching work, it just proved to be too much an accumulation. So Figueroa is ultimately came out the better man on the night, probably 7 rounds to 5 in his favor. I thought Magsayo got off to quite a big lead. I thought he probably won the first 4 rounds, but you could really only make a case for him maybe winning the 8th and 9th rounds from that point onwards, and the 2 points deducted pretty much overruled any realistic opportunity Magsayo had of winning. So congratulations to Figueroa. I feel at 126 his size and strength and tenacity is not quite as much of a factor and not as domineering as it was at 122, because he is fighting bigger guys or guys that are closer to his size, and now they're able to clinch him. He can't just bulldoze his way through exchanges the way he was against Fulton. Or even against Luis Neri, for that matter, who he was able to basically just walk through his shots and take him into deep waters and drown him. But some of the undercard fights anyways were interesting. Jarrett Hurd needs to announce his retirement, effective immediately. The second he wakes up tomorrow morning, he needs to publish an announcement instantaneously to whatever social media platforms he uses. I do not follow him, but whichever social media platforms he chooses to endeavor upon, he needs to instantaneously type up some type of letter into his notes app and state his commitment to retire. He's overachieved in his career, considering he's a late starter and definitely wasn't taught about many of the basic fundamentals of the sport in terms of footwork and certainly his lackluster defensive prowess. He's definitely made it very far into the sport, only having about 20-odd something amateur fights, starting pretty late. He's definitely gifted and overachieved to make it to the point to where he is now. But it's over for him. He needs to fucking retire immediately. Resendiz was able to walk through all of his shots. He was able to buzz him numerous times throughout the fight. Appeared to break his jaw and his nose. He opened up a vicious gash over his bottom lip on the left side. His jab was far more effective than Hurd's. Hurd's really didn't utilize any type of a jab despite having a significant reach advantage. He was trying to box a little bit early in the fight, as he did in his previous fights against Santana and Arias, and that didn't work. He was trying to utilize a Philly shell, but he wasn't blocking any punches behind his shoulders. He was just blocking them with his face, and he accrued a lot of facial damage, visceral facial damage. It's over for Hurd. I really do hope for his sake he retires, and I was kind of hoping during the fight for his sake that he would lose ultimately, because I did not want to see him. I don't want to see him with, 5 or 6 brain cells remaining in 5 or 6 years. But I'd say the most interesting fight apart from the main event, really on this whole card period. Trayvon Marshall picked up a good result, by the way, but a pretty interesting little result was the Amilcar Vidal fight versus Elijah Garcia, who himself is a young 19-year-old kid, has fought very, I'd say, lackluster opposition in many of his previous fights. Hadn't remotely tested himself even on Vidal's level, who's kind of posed a bit of false hope in terms of someone who can acquire a lot of success at 160 pounds. But nevertheless, a very good result for Garcia, a 19-year-old dude stepping up big time on his first major televised card, and he put on a show. Certainly showed some flaws defensively. I feel like he was having the bulk of his success pinning and framing Vidal's guard, which was a very repetitive and relatively inactive high guard. He kept an active lead hand, but an extremely inactive right hand. And whenever he would pin down his right hand, or should I say pin down his lead hand and deactivate his guard, he was pretty much tagging him up at will. Really tagging him up at will, period. Showed an effective lead hand and an effective jab himself. But when he was pinning, that's where most of his success came. But when he was switching into the Philly shell and things of that nature, or went into an inactive high guard himself, he was getting tagged up a lot. But it still ended up working for him at the end of the day. He landed a beautiful left hook in the 4th round, which put Vidal on unsteady legs, and he ended up pretty much just battering him to a finish. Vidal was out on his feet. The referee stepped in and stopped the fight. Very abrupt ending. Vidal, I do think, showed some flaws in his game. I thought Vidal had a little more success, actually, when he conceded the center of the ring and made Garcia follow him, because Vidal is not someone who cuts the ring off. And when he was standing in the center of the ring, Garcia's immense advantage in foot speed just magnified. And he was able to pivot around him virtually at will and land punches at angles whenever he really wanted to. But when he conceded the center of the ring and made Garcia follow him, his guard became more inactive. He started catching straight right hands down the pipe, and Garcia became a little bit less effective with his footwork. But that left hook that came and pretty much bludgeoned Vidal and ended his fight. Beautiful, beautiful shot. Any sign of youth at this pretty much dead 160-pound division is miraculous, should I say. So, yeah, that's my overall thoughts on the card. Congratulations to the winners of this card, Resendez, Elijah Garcia, Armando Resendez, that is, and Brandon Figueroa, on now earning himself an opportunity to potentially capture a belt in his second weight category. We'll see how he does against Vargas. Right now, I'd probably make Ray Vargas the slight favorite to defeat him, but I'd have to do maybe a little bit more film study on that fight. See kind of how Ray Vargas is going to be able to handle that pressure, because Figueroa is definitely a handful in terms of how he can switch in his volume and things of that nature. But have a good one anyways.